10-Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. I'm Joe, the host, and my dog is Harper, and she's asleep on my feet right now. I don't know how she does that. I'm not exactly quiet, and I don't sit still. But before long, you're probably going to hear her snore in the background. But if she was awake and could speak human words, I know that she would tell you to make sure that you're subscribed to this podcast. And yeah, I realize that some of the podcast apps make it difficult for you to find where to subscribe. Like not too long ago, Apple changed from a big button to a little bitty plus button up at the top right corner if you want to follow the podcast. And it doesn't always say follow or subscribe. They need to get on the same page is what I'm saying. All these different podcast listening apps, just get on the same page and use the same terminology. Because it could say follow, it could say collect, it could say subscribe. You just never know. And when you do subscribe to 10-Minute Murder, you'll get every single episode the moment that I release them. And plus, you don't have to search for them every week. If you are subscribed already and are looking for another way to connect with this podcast, you can follow on social media. Facebook and Instagram, the links are in the show notes of this episode, or just as easily, you can type in the search bar 10-Minute Murder, and it'll pop right up. And on Facebook and Instagram, I post photos that go along with the episodes that you're hearing about here. It's nothing graphic or gross. It's mainly just faces and places. It sounds like I'm trying to do poetry here. I'm just saying words and they come out rhyming. I don't know why. But anyway, find 10-Minute Murder on Facebook and Instagram and connect there. The story today is extraordinary because the killer was so ordinary. He's often described as, quote, normal looking by both victims and friends. He had everything to live for. 2 years into his medical degree and an upcoming marriage. He was known as the Craigslist Killer. Philip Haynes Markoff was born on February 12, 1986 in Sherrill, New York, to parents Susan and Richard Markoff. His father was and is still a dentist. You can actually go by his practice today if you are in Syracuse, New York. His website does ask that you book ahead, though. And this is probably why Philip felt so motivated to go into the medical field in the first place. However, while in his second year of medical school, Philip was arrested and charged with 3 armed robberies and the murder of Julissa Brisman. Described by all who knew him as completely normal, Philip actually led an alternative double life that started years prior. This double life eventually ended in a 7-day string of events that resulted in 3 armed robberies, a murder, and ultimately his capture. It all seemed to begin in 2007 when Philip became interested in alternative BDSM, kink, and other hardcore content on the internet, which he would look at under the user handle SexAddict53885 while he was at the University of Albany. He lived on the honors floor of his housing building on campus, and his friends remember that he would never really pay much attention to the girls they would meet. This was more than likely because Philip was enthralled with the world of hardcore online content. He was more interested in cruising Craigslist for erotic listings and sharing sexually charged emails with other sexually deviant people. He'd rather do that than interact with the typical college party girls that were around him. As of his graduating, none of the sexually deviant activities he partook in would be considered illegal, but all of that would soon change when he moved to Boston. On the outside, everything was going fantastic for Philip in early 2009. He was in his second year of medical school at Boston University and was engaged to be married to his lovely fiancée, Megan McAllister, in August. But by April of that year, this online sexual deviance was no longer working for Philip. Already familiar with browsing Craigslist for erotic-natured content, he came across an ad for a masseuse under the erotic section. This would be the start of his 7 days of rage. When escort Tricia Leffler met Philip in the hallway of the Westin Copley Palace Hotel in downtown Boston, she remembered thinking that he was tall, handsome, and extremely normal-looking. But by the time they got into the room and she turned his back on him, he had her at gunpoint, telling her to get down on the ground, where he proceeded to tie her up with plastic handcuffs and rob her. Interesting, Tricia remembers that he was polite while doing this, telling her to be quiet instead of shut up. And they say chivalry is dead. Philip proceeded to take her cash, cards, a camera, a few pairs of her underwear, before cutting phone lines and leaving her tied to the bathroom door. However, Philip's behavior throughout the robbery, as relayed by Tricia, was interesting to say the least. First of all, he was fairly calm throughout the entire process. Secondly, when Tricia realized that she was unable to get home without her wallet and cards, she panicked and asked him to return her ID so she could get home. After studying the ID, he threw it back to her as she was tied on the ground. As Philip left, he told her he'd wait a few minutes and tell the reception desk he heard something in the room, and they'll come by to check and release her. During this robbery, Philip made some critical mistakes that aided in the swift detection of his actions by authorities. Even though he wore gloves, police were able to lift fingerprint from the tape he placed on the victim's mouth when he went to leave. He also had his BlackBerry on him during the crime, which authorities could later trace, and the plastic cuffs were easily broken by the victim once he left the room. But maybe worst of all, he didn't wear a disguise whatsoever and was caught on security cameras entering and exiting the hotel. Philip may have left the Westin Copley Place Hotel calmly on the night of April 10, 2009, but it was just the beginning of his string of robberies and murder. Julissa Brisman did not escape the hands of Philip Markoff as luckily as Tricia Leffler did on April 14th. Just 4 days after Philip robbed Tricia at gunpoint, like Tricia, Philip met the woman he targeted next on the Craigslist erotica ads at a downtown Boston hotel, this time the Marriott. He was once again captured on the hotel's security cameras. Julissa was an outgoing woman, a part-time model, and in her spare time would offer massage services. The only reason she was in Boston was for work, and in fact, there was evidence her killer had received a massage before things went south. As with Tricia, Philip used plastic handcuffs to try to subdue Julissa, but she quickly escaped those cuffs, and evidence shows that she fought back at her attacker with all she had. The struggle meant that Philip didn't have a chance to rob her. Rather, the evidence suggests that Julissa fought him off and almost escaped. She had blunt force trauma to the head, meaning that he probably hit her when she resisted, and she was found in the doorway of her room, partially in the hallway, shot at point-blank range 3 times. Even though the bullets pierced her ribs, spinal cord, lung, and heart, she didn't die immediately, but later that evening at the hospital. With all the similarities between the two cases, authorities knew that both were related, and this fact was solidified by the footage of Philip entering and leaving the Marriott Hotel on the night of Julissa's murder. As with his first crime, he didn't even bother disguising himself and can be seen looking at one of his mobile devices as he calmly leaves the scene. But what he doesn't know is that authorities have been working to trace the emails between himself and Julissa, and they are onto him. Philip thinks he's in the clear, but in fact, it's only a matter of time before the police track him down. Before being apprehended, Philip's final victim was Cynthia Melton. She was an exotic dancer offering lap dances, who he met at the Holiday Inn Express in Warwick, Rhode Island, on April 16, 2009. Like the others, Philip found her through a Craigslist ad, and upon getting into the room, he bound her, held her at gunpoint, and asked her where she keeps her cash and credit cards. She said he told her that he would not kill her, to just give him the money. However, unlike the other instances, this attack was interrupted by Cynthia's husband, and Philip fled the scene. Authorities now had even more photos of the assailant and tracked the IP address Philip used on Craigslist to his apartment building in Boston. So when investigators staked out the area and saw Philip Markoff for the first time, they were astonished. It was the man from the tapes. They were looking at the Craigslist Killer. Authorities followed Philip for a few days before taking him into custody on April 20th, 2009. He was at that time attempting to go to Foxwoods Casino in Connecticut with his fiancée Megan. He was arrested and accused of murder, armed robbery, and kidnapping. His wife-to-be Megan stood by him throughout the arrest and said that the police were wrong, calling him beautiful inside and out. When they searched his apartment, they found a gun with bullets that matched the ones used to kill Julissa, plastic handcuffs, duct tape, several pairs of women's underwear, including the ones he stole from Tricia, as well as his laptop with communication with Julissa. Upon discovery of this evidence, Philip was arraigned the next day, April 21st. Although Philip Markoff pled not guilty, he was held without bail for the murder charge, and his trial was expected to begin in July 2010. In the beginning, Megan stood by her fiancé, but by the end of April, she visited Philip to tell him the engagement was off. And then she came again in June to tell him she didn't plan to see him for a long time. if ever. This sent Philip into a suicidal decline, and he was put on suicide watch numerous times throughout his stay in jail. He attempted suicide on the day that Megan broke up with him, and then again on the day that would have been their wedding day. But it wasn't until August 15, 2010, 1 year and a day after his wedding was supposed to take place, that he successfully took his own life. He made a knife out of a pen and piece of metal and used it to cut the arteries in his ankles, legs, and neck. Philip had also somehow managed to swallow a lot of toilet paper. He wrapped a tightened plastic bag over his head with gauze and had written Megan's name all over the walls in blood. His suicide meant that he had escaped being officially convicted of murder. And cases like Philip Markoff really make you wonder, how many normal people do we pass by each day that are hiding dark, violent secrets? That's today's 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. You still have just a moment to make sure you're subscribed to 10-Minute Murder before we scoot out of here for today. And I say we like there's multiple people in this room with me. I'm just by myself. I'm essentially talking to myself right now. And Harper, she can hear me. She's got ears, but she's a lady, so obviously she's ignoring me. Hit subscribe and you will never miss another episode of 10-Minute Murder. Connect on social media. Links are in the show notes of this episode, or go to the search bar in Facebook or Instagram and type 10-Minute Murder, and it'll pop right up. And lastly, if you have friends and you think that maybe one or two of them might enjoy a brief true crime podcast like this one, let them know about 10-Minute Murder. Have a good night.
10-minute murder. 10-minute murder. 10-minute murder.